interest in the field. And also it reflects the lack of workshops and the lack of information or publications about item writing. So hopefully this workshop will help just a little bit towards spreading, disseminating useful information, hopefully useful about item writing. So as Rob said, this workshop is going to be quite interactive, and I hope it will be practical as well. So you're going to work in groups in breakout rooms on a couple of occasions, and you will also have a go at moderating a set of items. But what I'd like to start with is the test design cycle. This test design cycle you can see on your screen has been adapted from Glenn Fulcher's book in Practical Language Testing. And you can see that this cycle comprises many different stages, starting from deciding on the test purpose, defining the construct, designing the specifications and writing tasks and items, evaluating, piloting, administering the test, making inferences from the test taker's scores, making decisions based on the scores. And then you can see that it's a cycle. So if after the first administration of the test, some changes are made and the cycle starts over again and again, desirably after each test administration. But today we're not going to talk about the whole cycle. We'll just look at one small section of it. This is writing tasks and evaluating and piloting. Just a couple of things that I'd like to note here. So first, all item writing should happen against specifications. So item writing is normally defined as producing items to a set of specifications. We're not going to discuss specifications today because it's a huge topic worthy of a separate meeting. But in everything I'm going to be saying, I'll be assuming that the items are based on specifications. The next step is evaluating items. Sometimes it's also called moderating items or quality reviewing items, which is scrutinizing items by several item writers who did not write the items. Ideally, or minimum, 2 other people should scrutinize the items besides the item writer who produced them. And the next step after that, and only after that, items should be piloted, or again, another term, trialed, on students or on people who are similar to test taker population. Item moderation is a step that is sometimes omitted from this test design cycle, especially if it's a smaller scale program where items are produced and then they are administered, or they are trialed on a couple of people and then they are administered. But item piloting is much more efficient if it was preceded with careful item moderation. All of us know that good item piloting takes a lot of time, and it also takes a lot of resources, and it takes a lot of financial resources and time investment and so on. So it doesn't make sense to pilot items which can be rejected at the moderation stage. So if those obviously flawed items were rejected during the moderation stage, then they will, our resources won't be wasted on trialing these items, so the trialing will be much more efficient. Another thing why moderation is important is that good moderation will produce recommendations for item revision, so that many items are not just rejected, but they can be salvaged, and then they can go on to the further steps and maybe then appear in the live testing. But I'd like to emphasize that moderation should not be used as a substitution for piloting. All 3 steps should be taken: producing items, evaluating items, and then piloting items. And another important thing about item moderation is that it's an iterative process. So it's not just items are produced, then they are moderated, and then they go for trialing. What normally happens, at least in my personal item writing and item reviewing experience, is that very small proportion of items are accepted once they were submitted, like on first submission from item writers. I would say about 5%. Then some similar percentage of items, or maybe a bit more, are rejected. But all other items, they just need further revision. So item moderation is a small iterative cyclical process, a small cycle within the bigger cycle of test design. And that's how it normally happens. So this was just a brief introduction of terminology and of the item moderation process. We'll look into it in a bit in more detail as this workshop progresses. But now I just like to ask you a couple of questions. So how does item writing happen in your organization? So what I've shown you a desirable process. So what process do you follow? And within that process, is there an item moderation stage? If yes, then how do you go about moderating items? In a moment, Rob is going to breakout rooms where you will discuss these questions with other 4 to 5 people. You'll have about 8 minutes for that, and then Rob will bring you back. Definitely. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. So shall we then, I can see that the majority of people have come back. So shall we continue? And let's just look at an example of how item moderation happens in a large-scale testing organization. Cambridge Assessment have published their approach to item moderation, so let's look at that, bearing in mind that the publication was in 2005, so now it's not even called Cambridge ESOL, it's Cambridge Assessment. So maybe some things have changed, but I trust that the basic principles have stayed the same. So you see that this is a long process in line with the test design cycle, but what we're interested in is pre-editing and editing of material stage. So editing is what at Cambridge Assessment, they call item moderation. And you can see that it is subdivided into 2 stages, into pre-moderation and moderation. So as Green and Jay wrote in their article, pre-editing is the first stage of the editing process, and it takes place when commission materials are initially submitted by item writers on the first writing. Then they have a meeting involving the chairs of the item writer teams, who are all experienced item writers, and Cambridge Assessment staff, and all together they consider the material. And importantly, at this stage, if they decide that the items are to be returned to item writers for revision, then they give item writers guidance on how they want the items to be revised. If they decide to reject the items at this stage, then they provide feedback on why the items were rejected. And these are the things that they are looking at during this stage. So they are looking to ensure that the test material is culturally appropriate and accessible worldwide. This is because at Cambridge Assessment, they produce items for global audience. So this might not be relevant in institutions that focus on local testing. They also try to ensure that all material meets specifications, and they also suggest changes to materials that require amendments or rewriting. So after the items come back from item writers revised, they hold the next meeting, which is called editing meeting. So they scrutinize these items again, and then they either approve them for pre-testing. So pre-testing is the term the Cambridge Assessment used for piloting or trialing, or maybe they are rejected at that stage, or occasionally they may be sent back to item writers again for another round of revision. So if this happens, then the revised material is then resubmitted for editing, and it goes through the whole cycle again. We must know that this article was written at the time pre-COVID, so the editing meetings happened in person. At the moment, I understand such meetings happen online. And for example, at the British Council's UpTest production team, all quality assurance meetings happen online. So quality assurance is what they call moderation. So those are, this is what happens in large-scale testing organizations. So what about smaller-scale test development? For example, at the language center, at the university, who also have to produce their own tests. Just, I'd like to suggest one method of item moderation using Google Docs. although it doesn't have to be Google Docs. It can be any file sharing system that allows file editing within the system. So for example, at Lancaster University, we use OneDrive. So you can, if everyone has access to it, then you can use that as well. I just use Google Docs as an example. As the first step, item writers will set up an item moderation group. And this group should consist of at least 3 people. They can be from the same organization, or they can, if there aren't 3 people who write items for one organization, they can pair up with some other organization. Why 3 people are needed? It's because each item has to be moderated by at least 2 people who have introduced this item. At the next step, they will create a folder, Google Docs folder, OneDrive folder, whatever, where each group member has access to. And then, and it's very important, item moderation routines have to be established. For example, who moderates what? Whenever an item is uploaded onto the system, this group needs to ensure that at least 2 people have looked at the item. And when there are more than 3 people in the group, then probably some allocations have to be made. A group leader has to be elected who will arrange these allocations. Also, the deadlines are important, so by when this moderation happens. And you decide on the type of feedback that you provide to item writers. And we'll talk about feedback in a moment, but just one more thing I'd like to note here. It's really desirable after items were moderated individually online to have a moderation meeting, similar to the one I just described for Cambridge assessment. Not only, I mean, there are several reasons why it's important, why it's really desirable. First is that you will notice that different people see different things, different problems with an item, and you will not always agree. So if individual feedback goes out to item writers, then this feedback can be conflicting, and this is not desirable. So probably it's a good idea to agree on what feedback goes to item writers. And the second thing that I find very important is that these moderation meetings are really developmental, because some common understanding within the organization develops during these meetings of what a good item is like. What are the common flaws with items and how they can be amended. So this is part of item writer development, such kinds of meetings. So just an example of how this can be done. I created a folder on Google Docs. I called it item moderation, and I uploaded a sample item there. It was written by a participant in one of my item writing courses. This is a B2 multiple choice grammar item. Importantly, the first step in moderating an item is doing it as a test taker. So just imagine you're a test taker, don't look anywhere, don't look at the answer key, and do the item as a test taker. So a lot of problems with the item will surface at this stage. And then comes the feedback. The easiest form of feedback, the one you can see as an example on screen now, is just highlighting and commenting on parts of the item. For example, here, and again, it's just an example, I saw that 2 options are quite weak, so I highlighted them and I explained, I commented of why these options are weak. This is the easiest form of feedback, and it's good as a starting point, and it's definitely better than just saying, oh, this is a good item, we accept it, this is bad item, we reject it, because it's some sort of feedback here. But it also has disadvantages. So first, there are so many aspects to bear in mind when moderating each item, even when it's a simple multiple choice grammar item, that moderator might easily overlook something. So you'll be looking at options. For example, look at me. I looked at options. I forgot about the stamp. Maybe there are some other problems here. So just when you don't have anything to base your moderation on, it's easy to overlook things. And second, such direct commenting, it tends to focus on item faults without acknowledging item strengths. So the item writer always gets only negative feedback, which is not very nice for the item writer, not very encouraging. So I believe a better solution is using moderation checklists. And I'm sure you've come across such moderation checklists before, or you might even be using it in your organization already. And the right examples of moderation checklists in the literature. So this one comes from Hughes and Hughes, a recent book, and this is for moderating grammar items. And this one comes from Miller and colleagues, and this is for moderating multiple choice items. This second one doesn't come from language testing, it comes from educational measurement book, but it's still, I find it very useful because some pieces of advice apply to all kinds of items of a particular type, to multiple choice, for example. But you'll notice that both of these moderation checklists have one common characteristic, that they have this yes/no thing. So when the moderators go through this checklist, they just tick yes or no. And this, I think this is a development from just commenting. Why? Because first, it doesn't allow the moderator to overlook things, because there are all these criteria here, and you can see how many criteria there are actually. Just for moderating a multiple choice item, there are 16 things to look at, and this is not all. And the second thing, if, for example, the item writer gets the item back and there are 14 pluses and 14 yeses and 2 no's, then the item writer will feel quite encouraged that the item is generally of a good quality, just a couple of problems there. But I still find that this checklist is not what I personally would want to use. This is because overwhelming majority of items have to be revised. And if an item writer receives feedback like this, for example, is this the most appropriate type of item to use? No. What does it mean, no? So it means that probably it's not the appropriate item type to use. Why? The item writer doesn't know. If item writer had known it already, the item writer wouldn't have written this item as multiple choice in the first place. So probably a bit more explanation is needed here, why it is not appropriate, and probably a recommendation of what would be appropriate instead of the multiple choice item type. So what is needed, and what I personally like using, this is the type of moderation checklist that I prefer. It has this extra column that has space for explanation of what the problem is. And then it has space for suggestions for improvement. So the moderator can already say what they want to see different. So how the item can be improved. But you're probably asking yourself at this stage, so there are so many criteria. Where do these criteria come from? Where do these 16 criteria or more come from? There are 3 areas where these criteria can come from. First, it's item specifications. Second, it's previous item moderation experience. And third, it's best practice for producing items of a particular type. And we'll look at them one after the other. So first, item specifications. So here is an example of the specifications for multiple choice B2 grammar items, the one that you've just seen in one of the previous slides. So you see it's quite short, and it has a number of requirements for the item. So each of these requirements can be turned into a checklist criterion. For example, the item has to be at B2 level. So the criteria can say the item is at B2 level of proficiency. Then the task description, it should be sentence completion based on the appropriacy of grammatical meaning and or form. So the criterion can be that the item targets the meaning or form of the grammar structure, and so on for each specification requirement that can then be turned into a moderation criterion. The important thing here is not to overlook and emphasize the intended construct. The most important thing that has to be looked at during moderation is where the item targets the intended construct as it was specified in the specifications. So that is the first source of moderation criteria. The second source is your previous or your group's institutions' previous moderation experience.
All right.
There are things that cannot always be included in the specifications. Some finer things, more finer details. Some organizations use item writing guidelines for that. So there are specifications and the guidelines as an addition to the specifications. So this is a similar thing. So for example, during moderation, you notice that although all or most items, most stems in the items are within 15 words count, but the stem doesn't provide enough context to ensure that this construct is tested. So you can turn this regular item flow into a checklist requirement. So the stem provides enough context to ensure that the intended construct is tested. And in this way, when you notice typical item flows, you add criteria to your item moderation checklist to make sure that these flows are not over. And the third source of the criteria is best item writing practice for each particular item type. So, for example, this is a checklist for multiple choice items. Here is a checklist for the for the short answer questions and so on. The important thing here is not to use, and these checklists are, they can be found, the recommendations for what a good multiple choice item should be like, or for what a short answer question, good and short answer question should be like, can be found in the literature. In the language test and more in the educational measurement literature, books have been written about multiple choice items. The important thing here is to note that these recommendations are very much item type specific. So what is important to look at for multiple choice items is very different from what you need to be concentrating on for short answer questions, as you can see from these two moderation checklists. And here I just would like to introduce you to the website. I'd like to share with you the link to the website that I've recently started, where I intend to provide recommendations for language test item writing. In this website, I will be adding more information about different task types. So for example, now there is a multiple choice, multiple match and short answer questions. And there you can see that I provide recommendations for best practice of producing these item types. And I also included moderation checklists for these item types, which can be downloaded from the website. All materials can be downloaded for free for non-commercial use. Just I've created this website as a service to the field, so you are very welcome to use it. And because the website is in the process of being produced, if you'd like to subscribe to the newsletter, you will receive information whenever updates, whenever new material is added. So what I'd like to emphasize here is that if you download the checklist from that website, please take into consideration that that checklist will not be enough to moderate your items, because these are recommendations for general recommendations for a particular item type. They will not reflect the construct of your particular item and the specifications, the particular specifications your items were based on. So the final moderation checklist document should be based on all three sources: on item specifications, on your previous item moderation experience, and you'll be adding more as you're getting more experience in moderating items, and on best item writing practice for a particular item type. Before we move on to the practice part of this workshop, I would like to answer any questions if you have any at this stage. And then we'll have some practice in moderating tasks and holding a moderation meeting.
Ask one question only. Yeah. I'm interested in, you talked before about moderation meetings and the situation where we're in, where a lot of things have to take place online without meeting in real life. Mm-hmm. Is there a danger never to have the opportunity to meet for real as far as item information is concerned? Because we talk about that a lot at our institution, that we have been distancing a lot. And do you risk losing quality when you can't meet a person in real life? What would you say?
Wow, I don't think so, to tell you the truth. because I don't think that quality can be achieved in in-person meetings only. Because if meetings are held live, for me personally, I'm now, during those 2 years of COVID, I'm so used to doing everything online that I feel as if people are here, work here with me in the room. So the important thing, I think, in whatever medium it is, whether you meet as physical people in the same room or whether you meet online, the important thing is that you do meet and you do discuss the items so that you don't provide conflict and feedback to item writers, and that during those meetings you develop common understanding of what good item type written to the specifications is and how items should be revised, how items can be made better. So, and in many circumstances, I know that in many, for example, if you are at your university, maybe you are used to meeting people face to face. But for example, in a large scale organization, they have their item writers all over. It's not feasible to bring them together, you know, in person, with their bodies into the same room. So this is the best thing, the best option to do it.
Well, in fact, I'm very happy about that answer because that's my experience as well. But we're discussing it very much at our national test institution. We do.
I would say whatever feels comfortable for you. If it is feasible at your institution to have a face-to-face meeting and you feel that it produces better results in terms of feedback, you know, that you provide to item writers, for example, of course, it's fantastic if you can do that. But if you can't do that, it doesn't mean that you should do nothing at all. Then the online moderation meetings do work.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Hi, Elena. I had a quick. Oh,
go
on, Rob. Go for it.
Okay, fine, thanks. So yeah, my question is about the different criteria, I suppose, used. So, for example, whether there's a humorous distractor or not, I guess it's quite easy to spot and go, okay, there's a humorous distractor there. Let's do something differently. But something that I find quite difficult is like assessing the difficulty, the challenge for a student. So, for example, the example here was a B2 level text editing or B2 level question. And you know, and I probably for everybody, you know, working out, is that a B1 level question? Is it B2? Is it C1? I imagine is a more difficult criteria when you're moderating. So do you have any suggestions for sort of doing that in a sort of reliable way?
Wow, I think it's a topic for a separate webinar, I would say.
Fair enough.
But I think there are ways in terms of text. There are so many measures now that have been developed and that different organizations use to ensure the text are at a particular level. I don't know, lexical complexity, grammatical frequency, grammatical complexity, structural complexity, you know, the topic assessment and so on. In terms of items, I think it's a bit more of a gray area. You can look at the sub-skills that the items measure. For example, we know that inferencing is not something to be targeting at lower levels. Yeah, but that is why I said at the beginning of this workshop that moderation should not cancel item trialing, because what happens is that we moderate an item and we think, oh, that's great item, so why do we need to waste our resources on trialing? But then when we do trial, oops, it comes up that test takers, there's something surfaces about the items which we didn't understand, because we are not test takers, because we are trained teachers, you know, trained item writers. We can't look at it from their perspective, so there will be surprises, definitely, and that's why items have to be trialed. But what I'm trying to say here is that there are a lot of things that can be noticed during the moderation process, and that there are a lot of faults that can be caught during the moderation process, because if you only do trial and you review your items on the basis of just trialing, then after you revise the items, you need to retrial them again, and that's again time, resources, test takers, and so on. So this moderation helps a lot, but doesn't cancel trialing.
Hi, Elena. You mentioned trained item writers just then. One of our discussions in our breakout group was around assessment literacy and the challenges of maybe involving moderators who are less assessment literate, especially in kind of small teams, I was wondering what you thought about kind of how assessment literate do moderators need to be, and could there even be some value in involving moderators who are not assessment literate if we're putting them in the place of a test taker, or they're acting the role as a test taker? How assessment literate and how item trained do they need to be involved in this process?
Well, if they are not people who are involved in the test design, then I would say it's not item moderation. I would say it's item trialing. It will just be item trialing on, for example, native speakers, which is also recommended. So, for example, Hughes and Hughes recommended first, you need to trial items on a small number of native speakers of the language, and then you trial them on the test takers. So whatever you want to do, but then it would be trialing. Item moderation is a stage where people who know what item writing is about and who then produce recommendations for item revision, something that probably people who are not familiar with the field will not be able to do. I would say that item writers, and this is a topic that is very close to my heart because I've done a lot of research into item writer training. So item writers have to be trained. Item moderators also have to be trained. And item moderators have to be practicing and experienced item writers.
Great, thank you.
Well, I think if we will probably move on to the moderation practice now, because we don't have a huge amount of time left. So this moderation practice will go into 2 stages. As I speak, Rob is posting 2 documents into the chat. You will be able to download them from the chat. One document is a B2 reading task accompanied with 4 multiple choice items. This is a task you're going to moderate in the next 15 minutes. This is an actual task and first draft of a task that was written for one of the projects I've taken part in. This document also contains some extracts from the task specifications. I'd like to emphasize that not all of them, because we just don't have enough time. Otherwise, it would take longer than 15 minutes. But it has some important information. For example, who the intended test takers are, what the construct is that is to be targeted for this task. And the second document is a multiple choice item moderation checklist that will help you with the moderation. There are also things to be said about the text. You will probably find a lot of problems with the text as well, but just for this practice session, because we have only 15 minutes, please can you try to concentrate on the 4 items accompanying this task. So you have 15 minutes to work individually to moderate the task, and after the 15 minutes, Rob will move you into a breakout room with the other 4 to 6 participants, where you will compare your ideas and hold a demo moderation meeting. But for now, you have 15 minutes to moderate this task individually. Welcome back, everyone.
Yeah.
I hope you've had a productive meeting. And while we're waiting for people to join us, would you like to share your experience? How did it go? Was it useful? Did you manage to reach some kind of consensus on your feedback? I can see more people coming back from individual rooms. So while we're waiting for everyone to come back from the rooms, would you like to share with us your experience? How did your moderation meeting go? Was it useful? Did you manage to agree on your feedback?
I think we all agreed in my group on the feedback. And it was just a question of whether we keep the writer on or not, really.
What do you mean by that?
Well, there were so many issues involved that, you know, is this someone that we want to train up, or is this someone who maybe needs to be looking to do something else? I'm being facetious here. I do apologize.
No, you're absolutely right. Sometimes we notice that the person is just probably not good at writing this particular item type. And here, this is something that I've noticed both in my research and my item writing and reviewing practice, that not every person is good at writing every type of item. There can be someone who writes perfect grammar items, for example, but they just can't do a reading task, or the other way around. So if we notice that, we want to take a note of it somewhere and then to allocate the item types that this person does best. Yes, but I agree with you here that this task does have a lot of problems. Right, so shall we I'll give a little bit of input on how to give feedback on items, my perspective, and then there will be a bit of time for Q&A at the end as well. So I believe that useful feedback to item writers should be actionable, impersonal, inoffensive, and positive. What I mean by that? First, it has to be actionable. For example, if you tell item writer, this is a wrong structure. What is the right structure? What do you mean by this is a wrong structure? So this feedback is not actionable. But if you tell the item writer, so this item is supposed to target relative clauses, and here I continue the example that I introduced at the beginning. But the options focus on tenses. Instead of varying the tenses, try varying the relative pronouns and or word order. The item writer is not particularly happy because the item is definitely faulty, but at least the item writer knows what to do and how to make the item better. Second, the feedback should be impersonal. If you word it, you use the wrong structure, bad boy. But if you write the item is supposed to target relative clauses, but the options focus on tenses, you don't focus on the item writer. You focus on the problem with the item. Again, maybe the person is not rejoicing at this information, but at least they don't feel personally offended. And item writing is such a surprisingly personal area that's something that I noticed. People put so much time and effort into producing items that when it goes out to reviewers and comes back all read and all criticized, then we feel as if our baby was criticized, you know. So just the feedback should be very, very worded very carefully, not to insult people who might take it quite close to their heart and who might not want to continue writing items. Then feedback should be inoffensive. And this is something that sometimes happens, especially with item reviewers who receive items with the same problems again and again and again. And I've told this item writer 20 times, and now he submits these items, and again, this problem persists. So it's easy being irritated to write something like this, but please restrain yourself. Don't do that, because the person just would drop out and stop being an item writer. And we do need item writers, right? So again, just focus on the problem, no, not personal, and try to tell item writers what you mean and how the item can be improved. And the last thing, and this is something quite surprising that came out in my research into item writer training, people asked to be told what they are doing well, not only what they are doing wrong. And you know, positive feedback, it serves as a reinforcement. So if you tell the person, oh, you do this really well, then the person will remember, will keep doing it like that. But if you just omit it and never mention it, so the person will think, am I doing it right? Am I not doing it right? So maybe they will stop doing it. So positive feedback is also important. But when the item writer receives like a barrage of this is wrong and that is wrong and everything is wrong, and of course there's no happiness in that. But again, when you say something positive, just add a note at the end. So, but maybe options are problematic, but the stem provides good contextualization, and you always choose interesting topics. Nice, the person is happy, they will be happy to revise the item and continue work. So feedback is one of the most important things, I believe, wording and providing the feedback that is helpful and that is not offensive. I asked once, and this is just a personal anecdote. I was talking to a very, very experienced item writer and item reviewer, and I asked, what do you think is the most important quality to be a good item writer? And the person said, thick skin. But probably thick skin, yes, thick skin is needed when feedback is like on the left and not when the feedback is on the right. And maybe we can keep more people if we word the feedback well. And I would also like to add, from my personal experience, the best item reviewers are the people who really share. They are normally, item reviewers are normally people with a lot of item writing experience. They are good item writers. That's why they are item reviewers in the first place. But they also should be people who are willing to share, not only willing to criticize, but say, look, this is a problem with your item. I noticed you have this problem. You know how I do it, and I approach it. You know how I generate good and useful, like strong options. Maybe it takes a bit of time, maybe it takes a bit of more writing, but this is the feedback that is really cherished, and this is feedback of a good item reviewer. Well, this is all from me, and I think we've got a bit of time for questions if you have any, or if you'd like to share anything else that happened in your moderation rooms, for example.
Elena, could I just ask you, you mentioned earlier somebody doing the same thing 20 times, even though you've given them feedback. Do you just keep going? At what point do you cut off and you say, no more?
You keep going as long as you need item writers. Yeah, because you can't just, you can't fire everyone. So then you're going to write all your items yourself.
You would hope that you would have some good item writers. You wouldn't have to fire all of them, but it's just from my point of view, when we have item writers who are not fulfilling the brief, it ends up costing a lot more to produce the materials. And that's the bottom line as far as my bosses are concerned. So it's taking away a resource from other people who could use that resource much better. That's my concern. So how do you balance that? Because I don't think you can just keep everybody on as an item writer.
No, I agree with you. Sorry, someone wanted to give you that. Please go ahead.
It's me, Elena. It's Glynis.
Yes, would you like to answer?
And I just want to ask Graham, really, because I think the onus in what you're saying appears to be on the item writer. But I just wonder, coming from a big organisation, if the item writers have been giving support, if they've been given professional development, if they've been giving training, if they're in that role, if they've been giving constant training, because it's sometimes very easy for people to lose focus on what they're doing because an institution doesn't give them support and doesn't give them credibility, and therefore their confidence can fail. So do you think that the item writers that you're speaking about have been given the necessary professional development in order to succeed?
I think that's a very good point, Glynis. I think in some cases the people I'm thinking about have been given that, but they tend not to learn and respond to feedback very well. So they have a very fixed mindset and they think that what they're doing is great, and they just don't respond to feedback. In other instances, for example, I've had cases where I've had visiting lecturers at university writing materials for me. And very often they don't get the CPD that they require because they're visiting lecturers, so they're paid by the hour.
Yeah.
And that's highly problematic. So I think I'm looking at different cases here, but yes, I would agree with you that it's important to do that training. You can't expect someone just to become an item writer. They need to have lots of input. But I have found in the past that some people take that on a lot better than others.
Yeah, I agree.
Thanks, Graham, for this point and for a great discussion, and Glynis also for your comments as well. Definitely, this is something that I wholeheartedly support. We can't expect a person just to be a good item writer just because they are a good teacher. for example. Item writers do need training, like they are not born item writers. But of course, some people will learn better, some people will take more out of that training and be better item writers. So of course, in the end, it will be an operational decision of when we stop investing in that person and when we have to say goodbye. But again, maybe it's a point of discovering what that person does better, what item type that person will be able to do better if they are willing to stay on. I know that some item writers, they drop out before they ask to leave because they feel themselves that they're probably not fulfilling the brief. Yeah, but I'd also like to just comment about one more thing. Sometimes our expectations of when a person will become a good item writer are a bit unrealistic. So we think that, oh, I gave this person some induction training, a couple of days, and then I expect them to be writing brilliant items. Sorry, this won't happen. Item writing is a complex cognitive skill, and there's been research that any complex cognitive skill requires years of consistent practice to become a really expert in that domain, and how much practice your item writers get. So they get a couple of commissions normally a year, so this is not consistent practice. So another thing that we probably shouldn't expect, for the items to come from the item writers in the first round to be brilliant, requiring revision. So what we receive is just like a mold, you know, and then we shape it and give feedback to item writers. It goes back, they rewrite it, and towards the end of this process, or cyclical process, we will probably get a good product. But we can't expect a great product just on the first attempt produced by the item writers.
Can I ask a question that came up, and I noticed in the chat someone's commented on the, I think it's also a interesting question about moderating the text that the questions come from. But something that came up in our group was the fact that the questions are quite easy to lift simply by word spotting, say, whereas in the specification, the construct, the reading skills that were being tested were fairly high level skills, like, you know, being able to recognize writer's opinion, for example. So would it be possible to sort of put the skills in the specification into the moderation checklist as well? Would that be something that might be helpful?
Sorry, I think I missed the essence of your question because I was just desperately trying to find that comment in the chat. So could you briefly repeat?
Yeah, no, it was just about so we thought that one of the problems with the questions was that the candidates could get it just by lifting from lifting words from the text, whereas in the construct, in the specification rather, the reading skills are quite high level skills. Yeah. For example, recognizing writer's opinion, for example. So is it helpful to have the sub skills within the moderation checklist?
Absolutely, because sub skills is the construct of what is being tested. It definitely should be the first thing. I would like highlight it and put it first in the moderation checklist. And I think I've found that message in the chat about having a checklist for text as well as the items. Would you recommend it? I wouldn't just recommend it. It's necessary. As I said, that what I shared with you is just part of the moderation checklist. So it should be the moderation best practice for the particular item type. It should be the specifications, which of course include the characteristics of the text and not only of the items. And then also from your experience, what are the problems that item writers normally experience while writing these items? All of this should go into the moderation checklist. Please don't take that checklist as I shared with you as a final document. This is something to add to based on the particular items that you're writing. I can see that we are coming to the end probably. Thank you very much for all the questions. I hope that Rob will be able to download them, and what I'll aim to do is to answer them on the website. I will write the answers and you will be able to find them on the website. So thank you very much again for attending. Here are the references that I've used. Here are some my contact details, and I would also like to ask you, if possible, complete a brief feedback questionnaire. You can see a link here. You can click on it, or you can find, you can scan the QR code. Thank you very much for engaging with this session, for attending, for doing the practical activities.
Thanks very much, Elena. Really great to have such an interactive session, and it really seems to have struck a nerve with many people. I'd like to say a big thanks from TAFSIG for you coming along, Elena, and maybe a hint
Thank you
for
for
the
inviting
future
me.
that we'd hope to maybe have some more involvement with you in TAFSIG in the future.
Definitely.
We've got our piloting network, which I mentioned at the beginning of the session, but I'll just paste a link in the chat. If you are interested in getting involved in piloting, which we're not just looking in terms of piloting with students, but also things like we've been discussing today, item moderation. We kind of imagine that as part of the piloting network as well, to connect EAP and language testers around the world. We've got some people who've signed up already. If you'd like to follow the link, you can join up, and there's more information there. Thanks very much, Olena. Our next coffee club is, a TAFSIG coffee club is coming up. Unfortunately, I've forgotten the date now, but that'll be going out on our mailing list, so just keep an eye out there. And we'll hope to see you guys soon.